Welcome to the 14th Annual Globalization Annual Camden Conference, which is entitled Globalization, Its Impact on You and Me. This has been a fantastic run this year, and in 14 years, I want you all to know that February is such a beautiful month in Camden, Maine, that we've never, ever had to cancel a conference. It certainly made me a little nervous this morning, but thank you all for coming and for being here today. I'd like to take a moment now to remember a dear friend and board member, Andy Rowe, who died suddenly this summer. He was a board member and a caring member of the program committee, and he was a creative voice for a program for the Camden Conference. And we have missed his good counsel this year, but we have taken what he gave us and used it to produce what we think will be an extraordinary program this year. It is, unlike some other conferences, a community event. And we have always tried, but lately even tried harder, to make this a community-involved event. And in the last 2 months, we have had what I call an extraordinary ride. We have lived in a global village. From Rockland to Rockport to Camden to Belfast, every library, every school has had some sort of program. Talked about worldwide genome explorations from Maine to throughout the world. We have huge honor, which he will deny, but I'm just passing it on. Pleasure to introduce to you Professor Michael Sandel, who will speak on globalization's impact on the nation state, the community, and the individual. And you are allowed to ask questions when he's finished.
Thank you very much, Sonny, for those warm words of welcome, and to the program committee, and to Anne-Marie, and to all of the many people connected with the Camden Conference who have put such thought and effort and dedication into the conference that we begin tonight, but also, as Sonny was describing, the many activities of public education that have led up to this gathering. And what strikes me so powerfully coming here, along with the warmth of the hospitality, is really the commitment to public education and the civic spirit with which it's carried out. And as we think in these days to come about globalization and its effects on local communities and nations and on the world, one of the things that's so important is to nurture locally rooted public institutions like this one, and especially those that, while being locally rooted, gesture, point outward to wider horizons. And so this is really a remarkable thing that you've had going here over the years, and it's a pleasure to be here. Now, I know that in the past you've gathered to talk about particular areas of the world, particular countries, or policy issues, and this is a vast, sprawling topic, globalization. I'll try to define it in just a phrase. Globalization really describes a world where borders and boundaries matter less. That's really what globalization is. Now, there are different kinds of borders and boundaries. The most familiar ones when we think about politics are the borders between nations. And part of what we're finding in the world today is that those borders are more porous than they once were, thanks partly to development. There are a great many who think that globalization has brought and will continue to bring unprecedented prosperity and affluence and rising living standards. And not only that, but as the boundaries between people break down and between nations, our politics will get easier. We will be less inclined to fight wars based on narrow ethnic chauvinism or narrow patriotism. The bounds of human sympathies may be extended as we learn more and more about one another's culture, as we all watch CNN and communicate by email and on the internet. There are some who even suggest that with globalization will come the end of war. It's been pointed out that no two countries that both have McDonald's have ever fought a war. That theory was offered just before NATO bombed Serbia, where the local McDonald's in Belgrade had to close for a time. A lot of the high hopes, the utopian aspirations, have to do with the capacity of the new communications technologies to bring us together. And hopes, exaltations for new forms of communication technologies are very familiar to all of us. Here's how one hopeful enthusiast put it: the different nations now stand in the presence of one another. We will know one another better. We will act and react upon each other. We may be moved by common sympathies and swayed by common interests. All of the inhabitants of the earth, another has put it, can now be brought into one intellectual neighborhood. These were people talking in the 19th century about the invention of the telegraph. People who spoke those words. In fact, one of those who developed the cable under the Atlantic that linked by telegraph signal America and Europe described it this way: it brings the world together. It joins the sundered hemispheres, unites distant nations, making them feel that they are members of one great family. An ocean cable, this is the description by Cyrus Field of the telegraph under the Atlantic. An ocean cable is not an iron chain laying cold and dead in the icy depths of the Atlantic. It is a living, fleshy bond between severed portions of the human family. Listen to that. Among the boundaries that are breaking down, eroding, becoming more porous these days are not just boundaries between nations, but also boundaries of a different kind that we sometimes take for granted. These are the boundaries between markets and areas of social life or public life where traditionally, at least, markets are kept at a distance. Let me give a couple of examples, beginning with everyday life. Put aside politics, put aside economics, society. Consider the case of bookstores. Now, when you go by a bookstore, you probably look in the window to see what books are on display. You walk in, certain books are up front or on the table. I used to think, naively, that those books were there in the window because someone in the bookstore, the owner or the manager, thought they were of special interest or importance. But I recently read that that's less and less the case. In most bookstores, especially the chains, like Barnes & Noble and Borders, those books are there because the publisher paid the bookstore to put them there. It's like paid advertising space. Now, this isn't true of every bookstore. It's not true, I hope and trust, of the Owl and Turtle. I know that because when I walked by there, I saw some very good books in the window there. It was always true, we always knew that in a supermarket, when you went in and you saw Coke and Pepsi stacked up in the front, that they had paid for display space.
or the different kinds of pretzels and potato chips. At the same time that we have to build a sense of global responsibility, we have to work from particular places, particular identities and communities, and fill in the layers of civil society intermediate between a global ethic and an individual ethic. And that's a much more difficult moral and political project than even the progressives faced. But I don't think it's one that we can avoid. But that's why we see today that particular forms of identity matter so much at the very time we're worried about the most global questions. Why, just as Europe is building up and strengthening the European Union, at the same time, there are subnational groups pushing for collective recognition and expression of their identities, whether the Basques or the Celts. Going on now. Now, you were coyly suggesting that certain political parties or politicians are more closely associated with this trend than others, but what's interesting is that in recent years, since the 1980s, it's for the most part been the Christian right and conservatives who have called into question the separation between religion and politics. The Moral Majority, the Christian Coalition, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and so on. And liberals, progressives, for their part, have said, no, we don't want to run those two together. That's coercive, that's intolerant. But now there's been a gradual shift so that across the political spectrum, there are voices, including among progressives, who say, religious tradition, if moral argument is to make a difference in politics, then you have to allow that some moral argument will be informed by religious traditions. In fact, not long ago, just a generation ago, it was those liberals in the left who brought religion and politics together in the civil rights movement. Martin
Nepal. I go to the University of Maine at Madras. Thank you for your speech. I have a question here about, let me read it for you. Globalization has its positive and negative impact to every country's societies and individuals. Developing countries like Nepal has hardly its own stable economy. Do you think these developing countries are ready for globalization? Like, if not, how do these countries have to prepare to become ready for the globalization?
The most damaging effects of globalization on countries without fully developed economies and legal systems have been where the walls have been dropped to speculative capital and investment. It's flooded in, but in very volatile and unstable ways, and then fled at the first sign of a downturn or of turmoil or of instability, and the effect can be very damaging.
Ultimately, I think we have to recognize that globalization is a political rather than a technological phenomenon. Now this is a point that bears some emphasis. The unprecedented expansion of international economic integration that the world is enjoying today wouldn't exist except for the fact that large parts of the globe, on their own, decided to abandon economic policies of self-isolation from international commerce. And this policy shift has been part of a much broader movement away from centralized state control in favor of decentralized experimentation in the liberal market system. Now, critics of globalization usually portray this spread of markets as the impingement of blind economic forces on otherwise functional policies. But in fact, the dramatic changes in economic policy that have swept through the communist and developing worlds over the past 20 years have been driven primarily by recognition on the part of national leaders that their state-dominated systems had failed. Failed in absolute terms as billions of people remain mired in grinding poverty, and failed in relative terms compared to the prospect. Over that same period, failures of interventionism prompted a wave of economic reforms in the industrialized democracies as well. Long route conditions is
IMF. It took me about 12 hours to get here, and I just arrived a few hours ago. That's why I look tired. It's because I am. There was a fog, apparently. Plane sat on the runway for a while. Then it's all downhill after that. But I did get here, and I'm happy to be here. And you know, it's amazing to see this kind of crowd this early on a Saturday morning. You'll never see this in Washington. First of all, in Washington, nobody ever comes out to really learn anything or to discuss anything in the interest of a dialogue. They all, first of all, know the answers, and they're deeply cynical. And the truth counts for really nothing at all. It's all about spin. Nobody will ever ask a question at a forum in Washington to try and get at the truth of the matter. It's always, how can I spin this? How will it benefit my organization or what I want to do? So this is a very different type of gathering. I'm always glad when I get to, I don't really travel that much. And I'm always glad when I get to talk and participate in something like this. Let me just mention briefly who we are, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. You can find us on the web at cepr.net. And most of the facts, everything really, just about everything I'll be saying, the facts and figures are all available on the web. cepr.net. I have a weekly column which is distributed around the country. Sometimes it runs here, I think, to the Knight Ridder, 400 Knight Ridder papers that subscribe to Knight Ridder. And you can get that, if you want to get it on email, you can get that on our website. And my colleague, Dean Baker, writes a weekly review of all the business and economic reporting in the New York Times and Washington Post, which you can also get by email. And one of the things I like to say about us is that we have turned out to be right on all the issues, all the economic issues that we participate on. And I want to give one example because almost everything I'm going to say is not indisputable. Like the facts I'm going to give you today are not indisputable.
They're a clarinet player, and they sell their services or their products, and then by doing what they do best, the overall product is maximized. My question is, in the case of a country's comparative advantage, there are natural resource endowments or cultural advantages of various kinds, but would you consider a country that says, well, what we do best is, we have a great many people who live in grinding poverty, and what we do best, better than those affluent countries, is make them, because of the grinding poverty, prone to work very long hours for very low pay, 50 cents an hour to make Nike shoes. Is that part of comparative advantage, or is that different in principle from resource endowments?
Yes, there is a difference. I don't want to be construed at all as a defender of slave labor in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I would readily concede that the United States is absolutely behaving properly, although I think trade sanctions are generally a very bad way and a very ineffective way to try to force countries to clean up their act. For those countries that are indeed engaging in legitimate slave labor, then we have absolutely no business trading with those companies, and I have absolutely no problem with the U.S. government saying, telling U.S.-based corporations that you can't trade there.
But slave labor is outright coercion. We're talking here about sweatshop labor, where the coercion comes, if there is coercion, from the dire poverty in which people live, not from coercion of the kind you're describing.
Right, absolutely. I just wanted to make that distinction first off. As for the fact that there is a low wage comparative advantage in many developing countries, I think that is absolutely a valid path towards development. Subsistence level farming or conditions of absolute abhorrent poverty, and to somehow blame these corporations that are going in and investing and taking advantage of the local wage rate for causing poverty is just completely wrong-headed.
All right. Mark,
briefly on that.
Yes. Well, foreign investment obviously can bring some benefits to countries, and the problem again is that it's just been grossly exaggerated. You know, China's development, for example, I mean, its enormous growth in the last 20 years had very little to do with foreign investment. As a matter of fact, you look at any of the fast-growing economies of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, foreign investment, especially foreign direct investment in factories, had very little effect on any of them. And the countries that did develop, and see, this is the problem with the theory of comparative advantage. I know I'll be brief as I can, but
in the politics of the Middle East is striking. It enables the Arabs to have access to an important source of information in the form of a cable TV channel. I'm referring to the winner of the first annual prize of Ibn Rushd Fund for Freedom of Thought in 1999, the Al Jazeera satellite channel in Qatar in the Persian Gulf. The origins of Al Jazeera date back to 1995, when the BBC, which had built a strong tradition of objective Arabic language news coverage throughout its World Service radio network, signed a deal with the Saudi-owned company Orbit Communications to provide Arabic newscasts for Orbit's main Middle East channel. However, the BBC's insistence on editorial independence clashed with the Saudi government's unwillingness to permit reporting on
This has politically on Arab countries where a great many people apparently are watching it, but they themselves don't have, within their own country, kind of media that represents.
There are two very good examples of that. One is the Palestinian uprising right now. Al Jazeera has been able to portray the Palestinian uprisings in films and criticize governments who have peace treaties with Israel, like Egypt. So within Egypt, it has had a big impact on the population who have watched the Al Jazeera broadcasting of Intifada. Egyptian government has tried to show a controlled version of it. They cannot show the control. So it has increased the public sensitivity to the Palestinian uprising across the Arab world. Now there are several reports on that the author mentioned 70% of the Arab population watch Al Jazeera. So there is a link between their public awareness consciousness of Palestinian uprising today and Al Jazeera. Another good example is the Bosnia issue. Al Jazeera portrayed the Bosnia conflict as an Islamic conflict and increased again the public consciousness within the Arab world. Many people in the Arab world hardly heard of Bosnia, the distinction between Serbs and Muslims. So I recall one Al Jazeera broadcasting that talked about why are Bosnians described as Muslims, Serbs described as race, and automatically portrayed this religious ethnic dichotomy. So it was a very important impact they had. So many of these countries have to support the Bosnian Muslims.
Does it have a destabilizing effect, or do you think do the local Arab countries feel that it has a potentially destabilizing effect on the regimes of these tightly controlled Arab countries without freedom of expression, free media, and so on?
Well, again, the king of Qatar contributed $140 million of his own money here. So wealth and money is very important, and the location of the Jazeera satellite TV is very important. It's in Persian Gulf, and it's totally subsidized. Therefore, when it comes to money and support, it cannot be touched.
Travel and the ability to move information so quickly. How do you see it playing out the contradiction between the tendency of globalization to westernize or Americanize or unify and the sense now of cultures that are coming together and finding their own identity, such as Basques or Palestinians or Northern Ireland, etc. There seem to be two conflicting tendencies in culture. It's an open question for either of you.
Well, we touched on this a little bit last night. I think there's a paradox, but there's also a link between the two poles of the paradox. In many respects, the recrudescence of subnational movements, ethnic movements, the assertion of collective identities at levels smaller than the nation
are spurred in many cases by a backlash against what are seen as the relentless homogenizing forces of globalization, and especially in those parts of the world where globalization wears an American face, wears the face of Hollywood and of Disney and of McDonald's and of Nike and of Burger King and of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And so I think that one of the dangers of the homogenization of culture, and it's especially popular culture, is that on the one hand it's terribly alluring, and many will argue that it's not the push, not the imposition that accounts for this, but the pull, the attraction, the liberating appeal and promise, though it's ultimately a superficial kind of liberation, but the liberating appeal of American consumer society and popular culture. That clashes, though, with local and traditional expressions of culture, and I think fuels resentment on the one hand, but also a resentment that also finds expression in movements for distinctive cultural expression, the preservation of tradition, the assertion of traditional languages. Now, a lot of that can be affirmative and is worthy of being affirmed, whereas some of it can be a kind of backlash spurred by resentment, and it's not easy to disentangle the two sources, but I do think these two tendencies go hand in hand.
Yeah, I agree. I think the author used a very interesting sentence, constructive tension, and I would give the example of Egypt again because I was there last year. Egypt is the most pro-American state in the region, but culturally is the leader of the Muslim world and Arab world. And within the Egyptian society, you see a huge presence of what we call globalization. McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chickens, American University in Cairo. American University, practically the only institution in the world that has still kept American mix of it. But it is there, but it's like fortress. American University in Cairo is maintained by about 200 guards around it. There are concrete blocks all over it. Student IDs are checked repeatedly. So you see this tension, so they come from the university, go to McDonald's, in between, they are under the influence of this local culture. And the local culture is represented by the clerics, by the community leaders. They see the expansion of globalization as a threat. That's how.
Opposed to those that are particular to globalization. And I agree with that completely, although you got to admit that globalization has so rapidly accelerated the pace of economic growth, it has widened that gap between the capacity of institutions to deal with it. You know, before, things were plodding along and bad things were happening, but the grand scale of these things is unprecedented. And I have to blame that on globalization because it's globalization that's allowed that rapid acceleration. On Race to the Bottom, again, Erin is half right. The literature shows that in most sectors, like the manufacturing sector, the benefits of lack of environmental regulation in developing countries is not sufficient to cause a firm to relocate to another hemisphere. That's not true in all sectors. In particular, the mining sector has seen an enormous shift from North America to the developing world in the last few years. And it's a very clear evidence of Race to the Bottom, where a lot of South Pacific governments, for example, have specifically rewritten their mining laws to make it easier and less liability intensive for mining companies to relocate there. So I would say that is a case of Race to the Bottom. So it differs by sector. You have to look a little bit further down. On how to promote good governance in developing countries, well, I think there's a lot that we know how to do and should be doing. The first that I alluded to in the talk is in our American diplomacy. Maybe those of you who've been in the Foreign Service can tell me I'm wrong, but if I think about how an ambassador spends his day, I get the impression it's like, you know, from 8 to 4 promoting U.S. commercial interests, and maybe 4 to 4:30 talking about human rights, and maybe 4:30 to 4:45 environment. But I mean, just the sort of allocation of our diplomatic, you know, attention and framing the agenda is very hard. So that's part of it, just the sort of bully pulpit part.
What about tea time or the sherry hour?
Well, you know.
I'm just trying to stir up trouble.
But then, just quickly, I also think that one of the good things that some U.S. assistance has done is promote the growth of civil society, which is terribly important in having the infrastructure to hold governments accountable. And I think Indonesia is a case where some good investments have been made.
Good.
They have real powers to do things. And B, how the development finance industry, if you will, takes advantage of a more accountable state with which to engage.
Who else? Number one.
Landing or a hard one, and what will the ramifications of that be for others? Health, we have 34 million people on the planet right now infected with HIV/AIDS. That's creating a huge crisis for governance that states might not want to address, but are finding that they have to. In terms of what my wish list would be for what should they attend to, I would say corruption. Because, and that's something they may be forced to attend to whether they want to or not, because of the disparities between what the private sector needs to be able to operate. For people to be able to tap into the benefits of globalization while minimizing the costs, corruption is one of the biggest obstacles for doing that. So again, that may be something that governments are forced to deal with by the private sector, while they may not want to take it on themselves.
I don't think I have much to add. It seems to me that this crisis in Africa in particular has been put on the agenda in an entirely new different way. Partly because regional groups' activities at the United Nations, even the United States was presiding the Security Council, whole group decided to focus on Africa and took the health crisis there to a new level of international political attention, I might say. And then the simple fact that Time magazine has 15 pages of the situation in Africa, where in Botswana, 36% of the population is infected by HIV. I mean, that's the highest number ever in Time magazine. But this kind of, it seems to me that, in fact, on the international agenda, you can't have too many issues. I mean, it's maybe maximum half a dozen, maybe 3. Because somehow the scope and span of political attention seems to be rather limited. Therefore, there is a little bit kind of competition between different global concerns to attract political attention. And I think the health crisis, the HIV in particular, is recognized in a different way.
Of global governance that might fill in the gap, whether democracy itself can't be streamlined or speeded up to be quicker, to rival the demands of time of economics and technology. Did I hear you right? But should it? Whether it would be advantageous to move a little closer. I think it's, first of all, I think that it's important to distinguish 2 different gaps. One is a gap between the scale of the economy and the scale on which politics plays itself out, of civil society, that are most essential to the cultivation of values and of civic virtues and of citizenship. What are they? They are those institutions that defy being speeded up. They are the most inefficient institutions. They are the ones least prone to productivity improvements. Consider the family. And how can you speed up a conversation with your son or daughter about what went on in school? Well, people try, families of course try, but it doesn't work very well. Religious institutions, educational institutions, which notoriously defy productivity enhancements and improvements, though we're trying with the internet and email and all sorts of expediencies.
Of using container cargo for terrorism, one of the reasons we used that example was to be able to get the attention of policymakers. We were able to get Senator Graham from Florida and some members of the National Security Council, etc., to listen to our presentation, as long as we mentioned some sexier words like that about the ways container cargo shipping could be compromised, when the same problems attend legal shipments as well. So I think there's some good stuff out there on globalization and the shipping industry. It's a hard issue to sell to political decision makers, and I would advise you to look at the website.
Concern I felt as a legislator. When we think so hard about what the role of government is here, we make such a strong effort to protect our workers, to protect the environment, and make sure that we're producing products and doing things in an ethical way. When we're
involved in foreign countries all over the world, we have to make sure that we take on that role as well and make sure that we're involved in the governance structures. It's all too easy to say, oh, as soon as their economy develops and as soon as things go well, they'll pull themselves together and there will be a governance structure. But clearly, that's one of our concerns today and one of the things that you've been talking about over the weekend. Now, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and you'll learn a lot more from them if you look at the bios, which are in your folders, or if you get a chance to hear them talk today. As I said, we have a wonderful group of people here with us who are very well known in the state of Maine for the work that they do and really bring a lot of interest to what we're going to be talking about this morning. Bjorn Clausen is the organizer and director of Peace Through Inter-American Community Action, which is called PICA, and the coordinator of the Bangor Clean Clothes Campaign. Bangor Clean Clothes Campaign has certainly made an impact here in the state of Maine, talking about sweatshop industries, where many of the Maine jobs have moved, and his impact is felt now around the country as they begin to expand what they're doing. Carla Dickstein, we'll go to Ned McCann, who's sitting right there. Ned McCann is the Secretary-Treasurer of the Maine AFL-CIO, Maine's largest labor organization, and he's also their Legislative Director. Ned is well known in the State House for working on much landmark legislation and also building coalition both with environmental groups, healthcare organizations, and economic justice concerns. Carla Dickstein's with us today. She's from Coastal Enterprises Institute. Carla and I have worked together in the State House on a lot of different issues, and Coastal Enterprises Institute is well known up and down the coast of Maine and throughout the state for their economic development work and their the presence they bring to the legislature on a lot of important issues. Let's see, then we have Russ Libby, who is the Executive Director of Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, who leads an organization of 3,200 members whose interests go well beyond just the field of farming, but also food safety, their wonderful fair review, the Common Ground Country Fair, the facilities they've built up in Unity, that's right, and Russell himself is a small farmer who goes home and tends the garden in the summer and makes sure he keeps his hands in the dirt. Lastly, but not at the very end, we have Des Fitzgerald, who just retired, as I've heard, Friday, and celebrated his retirement party last night. Des was the founder, as we all know, of Duck Trap Fish Farm. In 1977, he has served as its president for all those years as a well-known entrepreneur in the state of Maine. Also, in the last couple of years, served as the CEO of Contesea, which was the holding company that purchased Duck Trap Fish Farm. He has also been involved in Atlantic salmon in Maine, is deeply embroiled in the issues that we're concerned about here in the state with the salmon listing, with fish farming, and has been a long-time well-known environmentalist and former chair of NRCM.
So we'll fire away. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Shelley, for the introduction. This is a critical question. I don't know how many of you have read Carolyn Schutz's book, Merry Men, but buried about 400 pages into that 700 pages, she's got one of her local farmers out in western Maine standing outside the fairground talking to one of his fellow farmers, and he goes, you know, what happens to the rest of us when these multinationals take over the automobile and the food and the steel industry? You know, what's left for the rest of us? And I think there is very much a we-them dichotomy that's happening in the globalization, and you know, the blue collar, the people who are out there on the ground doing things day to day are feeling really powerless. They don't have a real sense of how they can be involved, what their role is, and I have to tell you, lots of times I'm in that same boat because I'm trying to figure out what is our role in this global world. It really came home to me a few years ago when I was at a meeting down in Massachusetts, and we got one of the chief food buyers for Shop and Save to come in and talk about local foods. We're talking about, okay, how can we do a better job of getting local foods available in the supermarket role? And he goes, well, I need to tell you what our idea of local is. And our idea of local is, can you get it to us in 24 hours? And he says the answer is, they can harvest food in the mountains of Guatemala, get it to the airport in the afternoon, it'll be flown to us, and it'll be in our warehouse the next morning. So what is it that you have to offer us that's any better than we can get from somewhere else? And that is the perspective of all of the large players in the global food system at this point, which is, what can you do for me? I don't necessarily think that's a part of the world that I want to be involved in. And I guess the contrast that I always go back to, because it's the one that's kind of been longest in my memory is my great uncle Arthur has been on the family homestead since 1914, I think he was born. And Arthur made his living in Lincoln his whole life selling feeder pigs. And feeder pigs are the little baby pigs, and he would sell them to people for about a 40-mile circle around Lincoln, which is about an hour north of Bangor. And they'd raise up their pigs for the year and slaughter them in the fall and put the meat away. And essentially, he made a full-time living for himself and his family over a 40 to 50-year period on 20 pigs, 20 mother pigs. And now we've reached a point in the country where if you are a pig farmer, set Arthur aside, he sold his last ones a couple years ago. If you are a pig farmer anywhere in the United States and you do not have a contract to sell your hogs to one of the very few processors, there is no market. We have this image in our head of taking animals to a livestock auction, and for the last few years, at most of the livestock auctions in the Midwest, in the central food production area of this country.
And these are topics I enjoy. I don't usually get to address them in the kind of work we do at CEI. For those of you who don't know, we're a community development corporation, and we are an example of the kind of community institutions that I think we've been talking about trying to build in as mediating institutions in this kind of global economy. And what I'd like to do is address some of my points today, specifically to the work that we do at CEI. We support small businesses in Maine through financing and business assistance, and we try to provide affordable housing, and we try to link jobs and opportunities for housing to people with low incomes.
My name is Ned McCann. I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the Maine AFL-CIO. We are the statewide federation of labor unions in Maine. I want to thank Roy Salzman and the Camden Conference for asking me to be here this morning, and Senator Pingree for moderating the panel and for taking all my remarks. I actually share a lot of the perspectives that Senator Pingree has offered this morning. For those of you who live in the Mid-Coast area, I want to take a moment to note the foolishness of the term limits law in the Maine legislature. I will concede my own bias, but in 16 years of work around the State House, you have lost the best legislator I have ever seen. Roy asked me to talk about the impact of the global economy on Maine workers, and I got about 5 to 7 minutes to discuss that with you. It's a very difficult task because it's a huge topic. Also, I'm Irish, and once I get going, sometimes it's hard to shut me up. From our perspective, the impact of the global economy, the growth and the explosion of the global economy on workers in the state of Maine is, in a word, devastating. Some of the statistics that Shelley mentioned earlier, I'd like to reiterate. The jobs that we have lost in the global economy tend to be higher wage jobs, tend to have health insurance and pension benefits. The jobs gained tend to be lower wage, tend not to have as much in terms of benefits. Very few have full health insurance coverage or pension coverage, and that adds to a host of problems all through our society.
Short remarks about two companies I've been involved with for the last 20-some-odd years. Since Duck Trap River Fish Farm and Atlantic Salmon of Maine first began, they have always considered themselves aligned with the seafood industry. And through that association, they have been drawn from day one into a totally global industry through their relationship with raw material supply, best practices, technology transfer, and competition.
Tell the store manager what concerns you have. When they hear from one person, they assume that lots of other people like you, and those concerns get to be passed down the chain.
But we take one last question up there at number 3.
I think one of the most unfortunate things that happened in Maine agriculture was the demise of the Kennebec Valley Growers Co-op in the late 70s. It was an effort to bring farmers together to pool supply and gain access to larger markets. Is there any thought about
bringing together another effort like that, another growers cooperative?
That have formed in the last 3 to 5 years, 2 in Aroostook County, 1 in Hancock County, and I think a lot of people learned from Kennebec Valley. It was an expensive lesson for some, but one thing they learned is that organization happens best when the farmers are involved right from the beginning. And
Accords or the Rio Conference on the environment, or women's issues, or population issues, or social development issues. All of these things are under the aegis of the United Nations. But by the time they get to New York and the General Assembly, some time has gone by, and what is finally endorsed and supported is something which is no longer groundbreaking and no longer tremendously newsworthy. But a lot of the action is taking place within the framework of the UN. I think the levels that Dr. Sandel was talking about have really been illustrated during this weekend, and particularly this morning, where we've seen some of the challenges and some of the needs and requirements to be involved at all levels. And I think that the importance somehow is to build these linkages between levels, and not to say this is just a Camden issue, or just a Mid-Coast Maine issue, or just a local issue, and therefore has no possible relevance anywhere else.
And one question which we should continue to ask, I think increasingly on these types of problems, which are nested and interdependent, that we have to ask, well, what am I going to do about it? What's my church going to do about this? What's my school going to do about this? What's the state going to do about this? Local government? What are other private NGOs and corporations going to do about it? For example, the issue, what one of the questioners brought up yesterday about having a code of responsibility, he called it a bill of responsibility, similar to the US Bill of Rights. Well, this is actually a growth industry right now, is writing corporate codes of conduct, codes of responsibility, and non-governmental organizations are doing the same, trying to write codes of responsibility. We should hold ourselves to this standards and this ethics in the countries that we work in, regardless of whether we are required to do so.
Or Marianne or anybody else might want to take a crack at this. Since we've talked about the need for accountability and participation in globalization, I think these are a couple of Dr. Verinen's points. On April 21st, the FTAA meeting in Quebec, which Mark, I think you referred to earlier, which is our backyard, they comment, are being planned to keep out protesters with a wire enclosure. Isn't this an opportunity for ordinary citizens to challenge the secrecy and face of accountability of what has been called NAFTA on steroids? Is that something you'd like to address?
Yes, I think it's extremely important. Let's see, who mentioned it? Someone on the last panel mentioned the FTAA as well. I think it was Bjorn. Yeah. And it is great to see, by the way, all these things that people mentioned. Let's see, Russ Libby's description of the attempt to maintain family farms here and organic farms, and Bjorn's description of what you're doing in the Maine legislature. And all of these things are threatened by these global agreements, which are designed very much to prevent at least any kind of governmental attempts to influence the course of economic development at the local, state, or municipal level. And the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, is one of these. And I can't tell you how important it is for people to become involved around these agreements. The scuttling of the WTO in Seattle was one of the most I know there were reports in the press that it all was a fight over labor rights between the United States and the underdeveloped countries, but that really was somewhat exaggerated. There was no real proposal if you actually did the arithmetic. But it was at least 25.
to have increased transparency of what is under discussion and increased openness to other organizations other than states and the representatives of states to have an opportunity for input into that process. So I think any way that those processes can be opened for public discussion will only serve to strengthen the eventual outcome and to ensure that citizen representation is taken into mind.
Just one other little thing to add to that. The FDA negotiators have refused something called Public Citizen that was originally started by Ralph Nader, whose name has not been mentioned, I think, this weekend. But one of his leading advocates, and one of the people working in Public Citizen now, the World Trade Watch, is a woman called Laurie Wallach. We had invited Laurie actually to come to this conference, and she said, well, she really couldn't make it, but why don't we try Mark Weisbrot, because he will be just fine. But I was listening on radio the other day to an address given by Laurie Wallach, and I was driving along in the car, and all of a sudden there was a great big crash coming out of the speakers. And she had been talking about the World Trade Organization, and she'd been talking about the process by which this free trade organization was begun, coming at the end of the Uruguay round. She spoke of the U.S. delegation to the Uruguay round and broke down, and I wish I had the exact numbers, but what she was saying basically was that in addition to the governmental representatives from the Commerce Department and the Treasury Department and some from the State Department, there were a few representatives there from organized labor in the U.S. delegation, but nobody from human rights institutions, nobody from environmental institutions. And the crash that came over the radio was the Laurie dropping on the table the book of regulations of the World Trade Organization. This free trade organization had a book of regulations that was 700 pages long.
And can I now turn the program over to Alexander Fogel, Sami Fogel.
Before he leaves, I think we should have a big hand for Roy and for the entire program committee. A lot of people had a hand in this. Paul down there, Jim Elgrant, Andy Moran, a lot of folks have worked very hard on bringing you these wonderful speakers. Again, thank you very much also to our speakers. We've heard a lot about locally, we've heard a lot about globally, and the key words, I think, have been shared with us: participation, community building, communication, relationships, partnerships, organizational pluralism even, and the interdependence of all of us. I think this leads us then to what we were talking about yesterday and the day before as well, that we are in this together to build civil societies and to bring about either new or rebuild old democratic institutions. Thank you all for coming. It's been quite a ride. We've enjoyed it, and we hope you have too.